Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for some. Thank you for joining us on the ESF Bright Talk channel. My name is Benoit Hendricks, Principal Analyst at the ESF, and I'm extremely excited to welcome you to a third session of the ESF Cybersecurity Showcase Week. And delighted to be joined by Dan Vasile, Vice President of Strategic Development at BlueVoyant. He'll be providing us with a perspective on what can be done to better protect organizations and their supply chains. So before we start, there are a few housekeeping items to cover off. The presentation will last for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll end with the question and answer session. So please make sure you type any questions in the question box on your screen at any time. All viewers are automatically muted, so if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please leave the webinar and restart. Finally, this session, as well as the session throughout this week, will be recorded and available on demand via our Cyber Awareness Hub, which you can access using the link below. So with this being said, I will now hand over to Dan and return for the Q&A in about 40 minutes. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Benoit. And just as a quick introduction about myself, before joining BlueVoyant about 5-6 months ago, I was the former head of cyber and privacy at Paramount for their EMEA operations. And in that capacity, I actually managed supply chain risks. So I have firsthand experience with that space. I've been through the pains of trying to manage a large supply chain. The presentation is going to focus on supply chain defense from a cyber perspective. And what I plan to do is to share with you a lot of stats and industry-specific insights, as well as some of the stories that I had to deal with in my professional life. And all of this hopefully will help you form a better picture of how to structure your third-party risk management program. Allow me to set the context first, because if you think about it, 20 years ago, information security used to be a lot simpler. You had a clearly defined perimeter, and within that perimeter, you had all the systems and all the data. That's all you had to protect, the perimeter. There was little to no outside world connectivity. You had a clear focus. But the situation today is very different. Your organizations rely on a number of, or have a number of core and business functions that rely on their end on an ecosystem of third parties in order to be able to deliver on the expectations. And those third parties come in different flavors, from cloud providers to SaaS solutions. But the idea is that all in all, you have this ecosystem that you need to reconsider as your new attack perimeter, that's your new attack surface. And those third parties process data on your behalf or have deep integrations, or are just part of the regular supply chain, but they are also exposed to cyber risks. So again, in effect, that's your new attack surface. And what we've observed is that the organizations that we've interviewed, they rely on average on 1,400 contractual relationships. So that's a pretty hefty supply chain, and that's the average. Obviously, you have much larger supply chains out there. So the BlueVoyant executes an annual survey assessing the state of third-party risk management. For 2022, the survey not only explored the scale of the challenge, but also the amount of severity of supply chain breaches. It also tracks the way that different companies and industries and regions are responding to a year of cyber crisis, basically. The responses have showed a fractured landscape, with different industries and different regions responding differently to the challenges posed by another year of costly cyber events. One of the major findings is that many companies struggle to assign ownership of their third-party cyber risk program. Sometimes it sits with information security, sometimes it sits with compliance, other times with supply chain, procurement, so on and so forth. So what we did was to basically collect a population and look at the population of about 1,200 chief information officers or CISOs or chief procurement officers, which were responsible more or less for the supply chain and cyber risk management. And they all came from companies with more than 1,000 employees, not what you would consider small, of course, and across a range of industries from business and financial services down to energy and defense. To gain a global perspective, the research was conducted initially in US, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, UK, and Singapore. Since then, we also expanded the scope of this survey with regional surveys. And if you look on our website, you'll find a Benelux and the DACH-specific survey. And the total surveyed population increased to about 1,600 respondents. Let's take a look at some of the findings in there. How many companies assess their third-party vendors for cyber risk? Well, the good thing is that 95% of them do something about supply chain risk, while 5% don't do anything. And at the other end, only about 22% actually assess the entire supply chain. So good and bad. They do something, they don't necessarily cover the entire population of vendors, and a few of them don't do anything about third-party risk. What about incidents happening within the supply chain? Let's start with the positive. 3% reported that they haven't been impacted by a cyber incident within their supply chain. But the flip side of that is that 97% of them have been impacted, and more than half have had 2 or more incidents coming from the supply chain. And if things can be worse, I can tell you that they're worse in Europe. Europe had the highest rate of reported malicious cyber breaches globally, with about 99% of the respondents, virtually everybody, saying that they had suffered at least one breach. And the highest percentage of respondents who said they planned to increase their budget for cybersecurity and supply chain risk. It is clear that yet another year of persistent cyber attacks, especially coming from the supply chain, has led to yet another year of increased investments in cybersecurity. But I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. How frequently do companies assess and reassess third-party supplier risk? Well, in order to answer that, it's worth thinking about how assessments are being done today. And there's 2 major ways to do these assessments. You have the traditional compliance-driven way, which is mainly based on questionnaires. You have a set of questions, you send them to your vendor, you get the answers back, you analyze the answers, and you decide whether you want to conduct business with that vendor or not. The other more modern, let's call it way, risk-driven approach by adopting an adversarial mindset and tool set is to look at the internet exposed footprint of your third parties and assess their cybersecurity state, right? And now coming back to the results from the survey, less than 1% of companies do daily or continuous monitoring. Obviously, you can't do continuous monitoring with questionnaires. You can't send questionnaires out there on a daily basis. I mean, of course you can, but you're not going to get a lot of responses back. You need to adopt that footprint analysis mindset and tool set in order to be able to do that continuous monitoring. And for Europe, again, a slightly higher percentage said that they only audited or reported on third-party cybersecurity risk biannually or less than that. And almost 1/3 of them said that they did not have any insights into whether or not an attack on a third-party vendor has occurred. So with that in mind, I think it's important to also know that even though some companies have the tool set capability to look at vendor risk on a continuous basis. They don't use it for that. They use it for regular reassessments. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that the golden standard for reassessments was once a year. You assess the vendor when you onboard it, and then you do this yearly certification cycle. Why is it crucial to have continuous monitoring? Two reasons. One, things change daily. The moment you get the questionnaire back from your vendor, that's the exact moment that questionnaire is obsolete. Things change on a daily basis. And the second reason is that even assuming that you have a point-in-time view of the cybersecurity hygiene with one of your vendors, even if they have patched all their vulnerabilities, some of them can reopen. And let me give you an example. We were working with this company. We've identified an open RDP port which shouldn't have been exposed. We notified them. They said, oh, no, this should not be exposed. First things first, because it's not covered by IAM. And generally speaking, we don't expose any RDPs to the internet. There's no reason for that. So they closed the loophole. They added the rule in the firewall, actually deleted the rule that opened the port to the internet. Oh, fine. We checked. It was indeed fixed. 2 weeks later, the port was open again. Same IP, same RDP port. We notified them again, and they said, oh, that's weird. We're going to fix it again. So they did again. 2 weeks later, sure enough, same vulnerability, same IP, same open port. And then they figured out that that was actually an automated script that was popping up the firewall rule that was exposing that system. So this should give you a good indication of why that continuous assessment, adopting an adversarial mindset, is paramount in order to be able to have a high degree of confidence in your supply chain from a cybersecurity perspective. So how quickly are emerging threats, and when I say emerging threats, I mean basically 0 days, how quickly are they exploited? If you think about it, you have a 0 day, and then a 0 day gets announced, and then the race starts. The race between the attackers to exploit that vulnerability, yourself to patch, and your supply chain as well to be able to patch. So what we've seen is that in 2020, it took about 42 days for a new 0 day to be exploited by malicious actors. That decreased dramatically in 2021 to 12 days. And I can tell you that the trend is continuing downwards for 2022. The other side of that problem is that we need to patch. How long does it take to patch the same vulnerability? Well, on average, 200 days. And I need to tell you that with these numbers, if you read them from different reports, they're going to be different. What's constant is the order of magnitude gap between the time to exploit and the time to patch. And unfortunately, that's not in our favor. Let's take a look at some industry-specific data, and let's start with logistics. Shipping and logistics is vulnerable as a sector because it is targeted both by nation-state groups as well as cyber criminals. We have geopolitical tensions and other political issues, and I don't need to enumerate it to you. You've read the news probably, and you know what's causing troubles across the world nowadays. The boundary between cyber activities and geopolitical contestation is weak at best, and private businesses are often a softer target for such activities than state institutions. And NotPetya, remember that. The rapid spread of NotPetya is a particularly powerful example of that. It was initially targeting Ukrainian businesses as part of an ongoing Russian operation, after which the infection spread more widely than was foreseeable in the beginning. Everybody knows seem to know at least about the Maersk cyber incident. Very few seem to remember that Maersk was actually a collateral victim of a nation-state actor. Since back in 2012, Ukraine and Russia have been fighting an undeclared cyber war, if you will, that served as a proving ground for Russia's cyber warfare tactics. A group of Russian hackers called Sandstorm had compromised the Ukrainian government and dozens of Ukrainian companies. One way the Russians were able to apply such a broad sweeping campaign was through the compromise of a small software company called Linkos Group. Linkos Group was distributing an accounting software package called ME-Docs, and this software was used by nearly everyone who did business in Ukraine and gave Sandworm a vast attack surface, right? Sandworm hijacked the firm's update servers in 2017, early 2017, and this gave them backdoor access to tens of thousands of computers running ME-Docs. In June 2017, Sandworm started to use a new cyber weapon, which we now call NotPetya. It was called NotPetya because it was actually differentiating it from Petya, which was yet another ransomware tool that was deployed in the wild. And it turns out for Maersk that one single infection was responsible for the compromise. ME-Doc had been installed on a company computer in Odessa, and this was all NotPetya needed to infect their entire network. Across the globe, they had port facilities shut down, thousands of truckloads were turned away, their entire booking system went down. And as well as the complex loading system used to load container ships to avoid capsizing them. So basically everything was down from an operational perspective. And again, this is not to shame Maersk in any way. In my opinion, they acted quite well in the recovery process. Of course, they should have done better preparing for such an event. But in hindsight, everything seems obvious. And I'm actually impressed by the complexity of the recovery process. They were lucky as well because they had a clean copy of the data that wasn't infected by ransomware. And there was a stroke of luck because it was basically a server somewhere in Africa that had a power outage while the ransomware was spreading out. Getting that data back into Europe was also very interesting. They couldn't transfer it. It was way too slow. So they actually had to fly the hard drives back into Europe where they started the mitigation work. All in all, the details are really interesting, both, and most of them are out there, both in terms of how deeply that supply chain attack impacted them and how they managed to actually recover. When it was all over, I think Maersk estimated that the NotPetya attack cost them between 250 and 300 million, though many believe this number was on the low side. And costs down the line were also very significant. Trucking companies lost millions of dollars. TNT Express lost about 400 million. And Merck, not Maersk, Merck, the pharma company, lost about 870 million. Disruption to the global supply chain, of which Maersk was a major component, was extensive, and the losses most likely accumulated into the billions. Let's take a look now at another aspect of the logistics vertical. A report from an Israeli cybersecurity company called Naval Dome says that the number of attacks on the shipping industry has soared by 400%. Cyber attacks against operational technology, OT, in the maritime industry have increased tenfold. There were 50 of them in 2017, and that went up to 500 in 2020. And the report stopped in 2020, but rumor has it that the trend is upwards, and there's a strong interest in attacking operational technology, probably due to the weaker security controls. Based on what we've just presented, you'd think that the logistics industry vertical would have its ducks in a row after all these. Well, things are improving for sure. However, a BlueVoyant study looking at 20 leading logistics company shows that there's definitely room for improvement. All of the 20 companies that we looked at with having an online presence have some measure of malicious traffic. Much of that traffic, like the programmatic botnet traffic, is not especially targeted or sophisticated, but typically with evidence of brute force attacks and the use of proxy servers, that suggests a more intentional targeting. The percentage of such traffic suggests that the threat actors recognize supply chain companies as a high value target. They know that they can breach further through them. And we also looked at for evidence of the target company's infrastructure attempting to communicate with known malicious domains and IP addresses. Traffic from a company to a malicious IP or domain is sometimes simply an evidence of just regular security software conducting some routine reconnaissance of said suspicious domains. However, it can also be suggestive of compromise, a network or device reaching out to a malicious command and control server, for example. And one of the 20 companies has been observed to communicate with known ransomware infrastructure. Here's a quick example from November 2019. StreetKeep, a notorious and prolific seller of hacked corporate accesses, offered access to a US logistics company. The screenshot is also illustrative of the quantity and quality of the information provided by threat actors. And I know it's a bit dated as an example, but I can assure you such transactions happen regularly. Access to logistics companies, servers and premises is being sold on the dark web. These are not, strictly speaking, ransomware attacks. The selling of access to corporate networks in return for money or cryptocurrency in this case, though they could be used as an entry point for ransomware attacks. Cyber criminals using the access that they just bought could potentially employ a wide range of attacks from fraud to data theft, ransomware as well. Let's take a look at the media industry. We performed a cyber posture analysis of the vendors in the media industry sector. The approach was to identify and analyze the most prevalent vendors in the industry. We call them top media vendors, as well as look at the extended vendor ecosystem for comparison. We looked at almost 500 vendors in total. The media value chain is complex, from script to concept to camera, from camera all the way down to consumer. Media companies are highly dependent on vendors, service providers, partners, technologies, you name it, they have it. The third-party ecosystem is particularly fragmented in the media industry, and its dependence on a large number of vendors, varied in size and cyber exposure, of course, adds to the complexity of managing risk. And this might not be down your alley in terms of an industry vertical. Not all of you probably work in the media industry. But here's a good exercise for all of you. Think of the value chain or chains for your companies and for your industries. It will help you better understand and prioritize your third-party ecosystem. You'll know which ones pose the most risk and which ones to deal with first. Our study focused on what we call zero tolerance findings. A zero tolerance finding, in our perception, is a vulnerability that is commonly targeted by malicious actors and whose remediation, either patch or configuration change, is readily available and easily implemented. These kinds of findings should urgently be fixed, as we observe active signs of exploitation of such vulnerabilities in the wild. So across the 485 companies that we've assessed, we've identified 143 of them with zero tolerance findings. And the distribution across top vendors and the extended ecosystem is roughly the same. About 30% of them have some zero tolerance findings exposed. See that green line? That green line representing the average. That average sits at about 15%. And it shouldn't give you a false sense of security. If you manage to get your third-party ecosystem below that line, that doesn't mean you're secure, because we call them zero tolerance findings for a reason. The appetite for them should be zero or very close to zero. But that's the average across all industries, right? Now, let's take a look at the distribution across the value chain. It disproportionately impacts content management, the content management segment. That's why I said to think in terms of value chains. It helps you figure out which section of the value chain might be impacted more by your relationships with third parties. Half of the top media vendors providing content management solutions have been identified with potentially compromising vulnerability. And I do get this question a lot. Should we then just ditch all the content management vendors? Well, I'm an optimist, even though I work in cybersecurity. And I always say, no, just choose wisely. Half of them show a good cybersecurity posture, glass half full. Find the right vendors with good cybersecurity hygiene. One more thing to note on this, this chart. The only segment of the media value chain performing slightly better than the multi-industry average is monetization. And here's a personal speculation on that. These monetization companies are newer companies. They have a newer technology stack, less legacy systems, more focus on security by design, by default, and probably more regulated because they do process payments, right? So that combination drives that entire space to a better cybersecurity posture. This is from a yet to be released study on the auto industry. You're the lucky audience to see these numbers first. The focus was the 100 top suppliers for the automotive industry. We looked at their external cybersecurity, again, the same adversarial approach. These 100 vendors are relatively evenly distributed across different geographies, North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. The good part of it is that 70% of them showed very good cyber hygiene. And the flip side is that 30% of them are potentially compromisable via the what we mentioned earlier, the zero tolerance findings. These results are very similar to the media industry. However, the distribution of those zero tolerance findings is different. So keep an eye out for the report. It should come out in the next month or so, and it's going to provide you with a lot more insight. Let's take a look at semiconductors. And everybody knows we had a pandemic starting at the beginning of 2020. An undesired byproduct of that is that in late 2020, the automotive industry was forced to cut production. As demand for vehicles rebounded much faster than anticipated, car makers found themselves looking for semiconductor chips, right? And these are components that control pretty much everything in a modern car. The supply chain is controlled by a small handful of companies in a select number of countries that are not actually distributed evenly across the globe. If I ask my family what TSMC is or does, they have no clue, even though TSMC probably powers their mobile phones and everything that they use and has an electronic component in them, right? And TSMC Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company controls more than 50% of the third-party fabrication market, right? The segment that produces the semiconductors. And they produce chips for the likes of Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, you name it, they basically produce it for them. Moreover, many companies within the already siloed semiconductor value chain outsource their production to TSMC, Qualcomm, AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. These major players in the market outsource their entire production to TSMC. This should give you a greater appreciation from a geopolitical perspective of the situation between China and Taiwan. The next two largest producers sit at 18% for Samsung and at 8% for GlobalFoundries. So between the three of them, they control 3/4 of the chips that are manufactured globally. Now, we ran a study and we looked at 17 major players in the semiconductor industry. All of them demonstrated targeting from malicious infrastructure. Of the 17, 3 of them in particular saw more inbound traffic than the others by a striking percentage. 92% of inbound malicious traffic were targeting 3 US-based semiconductor companies. And these companies do only design. They don't manufacture any chips. And that goes to show that threat actors are interested also in intellectual property, not just disrupting the manufacturing process. A majority of entities also demonstrated targeting by known ransomware IPs and also brute force attacks. And that goes to show, kind of the varied interest of these malicious actors, from stealing intellectual property that could probably be a nation state to ransomware that could be a cyber criminal group. While high volumes of targeting are not necessarily a surprising discovery, the widespread lack of adequate protections against such targeting certainly is. Port security represents one of the first barriers against malicious actors and one of the top vectors for ransomware. More than 60%, I think, comes through brute forcing RDP ports. 94% of the examined entities showed open at-risk ports, and 24% showed evidence of open RDP ports. Another quarter of them showed open authentication ports. 18% showed open data store ports. So a lot of exposed footprint in the semiconductor industry for attackers to poke around and try to find ways in. I don't want you to think that I've tried to paint a doom and gloom picture by just telling you all these things. We all know that the situation in the third-party cyber risk space is complex, to say the least. But again, how do we fix all these things? There's obviously no silver bullet. You need to do strategic planning and you need very focused execution on your third-party risk management strategy. But for more on that, we'll have a dedicated session at the ISF World Congress next month. And we'll be delighted to have you all in the room with us. Invite your friends as well. Whomever is attending can gain a lot of insight into how to approach this from a strategic angle. Our session is on Monday. I believe it's 12:15 Central European time, so it might be 11:15 local time in Manchester. Check the agenda. You'll see BlueVoyant and my name there. Now, I'll leave you with a small parting gift, if you will. If you use the QR code, you can download the global survey. There's a lot more research material on our website, more specific per industry or per geography, depending on what you're interested in. Feel free to go and browse the information there. Now, with that, we'll open up for questions now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Very interesting surveys, very interesting insights on the industry specifics as well. So thank you for that. I can see a couple of questions coming. So I'll start with the about the industry verticals. So you mentioned a couple of results by industry. Yeah, what are the most secure industry verticals, and are there any particular regions, countries more secure than others?
Yeah, if you're looking for a particular region and industry to work in, if you want to be in a secure space, I think you should be working in finance for a company in Singapore. I'll take those two separately, right? Finance, generally speaking, because it's a heavily regulated industry and because it has the not only the regulatory compliance pressure on them, but also the means to deliver on cybersecurity, generally tends to be below that industry average that I was speaking about at 15%, right? And Singapore, it's very interesting, right? The numbers that we always see from Singapore are always much better than the rest of the world. And again, it's only my personal speculation. It's a combination of regulatory pressures on them and also the local culture. People tend to comply with regulations over there.
Right, interesting answer there. Yeah, Singapore and financial services. I would have guessed for financial services, but maybe not Singapore.
Numbers don't lie.
I'd be interested in asking you what is the worst one, but I won't.
Yeah, I would try to dodge that answer anyway.
Right, going on to a more serious question. Can you, and a real question from the audience, yeah, not my question. Can you give us some examples of zero tolerance findings? Yeah, we talked about zero tolerance findings. Do you have any examples, practical examples?
Sure. I've already mentioned a couple of them, but I'll try to group them because in my head, there's three major categories of zero tolerance findings. You have critical IT hygiene items. Not all of them. There's a lot of IT hygiene items. They should be fixed, but the critical ones are generating most of the risk. You have things like open ports, open portals without proper identification on them that could easily be brute forced. These type of things, we see them being exploited by malicious actors. So that's why I think you should focus on this. And usually they're not out there on purpose. The company did not intend to expose that RDP port. It happened, probably a developer for convenience opened up that firewall port, right, and created the script to reopen it. But again, critical IT hygiene. The second one is critical vulnerabilities. If you still have an unpatched Confluence server, we had a zero day popping up earlier this year. So if you didn't patch your system, it's probably compromised by now. So those type of vulnerabilities, because you have CVEs every day, basically, but there's only a handful that are going to impact your internet exposed footprint on an annual basis. Start with those. That's the second category. And the third category, right, with the emergence of especially proprietary data sources, you can now look at the vendor footprint and see if they're beaconing out traffic to known malicious endpoints, either a compromised system or a command and control center. That's rarely a good sign and needs to be investigated. So these are kind of the three major categories you should be considering when you think in terms of zero tolerance findings.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I guess delving a little bit into these questions, the pressure on suppliers to fix or to resolve these zero tolerance findings is high, yeah, and it's probably hard to get them to fix this. Yeah.
Correct, and that requires a communication strategy, because if you send them a report with thousands of findings, they will ignore it. If you narrow it down to that one risk that generates one vulnerability that generates 99% of the risk, and you say, hey, you have a Confluence server which is exposed to the internet. It's not patched. Here's the link to the Atlassian advisory. Here's the CVE link. please let us know. You'll be surprised that they are actually responsive, but it does require effort on your end.
Communication efforts. Those are questions. Are there, you touch a little bit on security assessments. Security assessments are widely discussed when we talk about supply chain security. Are there a necessary evil? Are there, the question is, are security assessments through questionnaires effective?
If done properly, yes. And what I mean by that is that don't build questionnaires with 1,200 questions, because you're only going to annoy your supply chain, and you won't have time to actually evaluate all those answers. So be very pragmatic about that. Try to standardize as much as possible. There are a couple of initiatives out there. Try to steer away from binary questions. I'll give you one example. One of the questions that I see the most is companies asking their vendors, do you have a vulnerability management program in place? And they say yes. Everybody says yes to that, right? If they do an annual scan, that's their vulnerability management program. But that's not enough. Maybe you could have a question like, how often do you scan? What's the scope of the scan, right? Those should give you a better view inside the workings of the company. And try to ask questions that you could later verify by looking at the footprint. If you ask them about their patching cycle and they say it's 3 months, you can observe that. Do they actually patch within the 3 months? If not, then you actually have a finding and you can go back to the vendor. So again, I'm not sure if they're the necessary evil per se, but if done correctly, they can definitely supplement and enhance the overall third-party risk management strategy.
So drilling down a bit, and yet you still have this sort of basic cyber hygiene. Yeah, you mentioned that several times needed. So I guess that's a sort of higher level questionnaire. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Right.
Yes. And then drilling down, like you said, I'm trying to understand a bit more the patching cadence and then what type of vulnerabilities are being fixed and how quickly.
And be able to observe that, in practice rather than rely on self-certification.
Yes. Next question is if one of my suppliers has a cybersecurity incident, how quick could it be recognized and reported to me?
Very complex question there. So think about it. If you rely on questionnaires and you got your questionnaire today, and then the breach happens tomorrow, it will take you 364 more days to figure out that happened, if at all, right? So 2 things there. One, make sure you have contractual agreements which obliges the vendor to report material cybersecurity breaches back to you. That should be kind of the legal avenue for you to know about those breaches. Standard contractual language for both cybersecurity and privacy should take care of that. The other way you can look at it is, again, observing from the outside. If they have been breached, there are some signs of compromise, probably. Their infrastructure is beaconing out traffic to malicious infrastructure. If you observe that, you can be proactive. You don't have to wait for them to come to you. You can actually go to them and ask, hey, have you been breached? It might come to them as a surprise, but you might actually be in a better posture telling them that they have been breached and being in a position to be able to cut the communication with them if need be.
Thanks for that. Just got time for a few more. Yeah, 1 or 2 more questions. I've got one more coming up, and then we'll wrap up soon. Is there a sense that supply chain security is being handled well across industries, or are companies mostly struggling? As you touched quite a bit on that, but if you want to recap, maybe.
Yeah, indeed. The honest answer is no. And the reason for that is because this is a relatively new discipline. Put it in perspective with network security. Network security has been around for decades. We have a standardized way. We have providers. For third-party risk, the problem was how it came into existence. It came from a compliance standpoint with a compliance mindset. Thus, the question is, right? When cybersecurity started to get involved with this, they've identified all these threat intel activities that can be performed on the vendors. So again, to answer the question, no, I don't think it's being handled correctly, and I think it's an evolving space within cybersecurity discipline, and I think with the emergence of new data sources, I think we're getting closer to what it should look like and act effectively.
Yes, and certainly an interesting field to be working in, and that's what we were discussing as well earlier before
Correct.
Before we starting this webinar, Daniel. There's a lot of ways of looking at it. I liked your analysis on the value chain as well. That's quite an interesting aspect, yeah. And you look at all the potential vendors that are responsible for their delivering a process, and then you can identify the most important ones you need to focus on. So that's another angle to look at it. Still a few questions coming up. I think it's worth carrying on, yeah. We did say 45 minutes, but we've got until the hour, so I'll carry on a few more questions. How important is the right to audit in contractual requirements?
Yeah, actually, we go into more details with other presentations into all the activities that can be performed. How important it is, it depends, obviously. If you can put it in there through standard contractual language, then do so. I would only audit like in-depth, either physical on-site audits or penetration tests or something like that for a handful of critical vendors. I wouldn't do that for all the vendors. One, again, whatever you do, that audit is still point in time, right? If you do it today, you have the results for today. And secondly, it's very costly, both for you and for your supplier that has to go through the audit. So keep it in the contract if you can, that's fine. Limit the scope and the number of suppliers that are going to go through this process.
Thank you, Dan. It's a very interesting answer, very good way to look at it. It is extremely time-consuming and costly to do on-site audits, but necessary in some cases. I don't see any more questions coming. I think we'll close for now. Did you want to say a few final words before I close down?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Again, looking forward to seeing everybody at the World Congress in Manchester. And we're going to dig deeper, I promise you, into the tactics beyond the strategy on how to put together a comprehensive third-party risk management program.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and surely looking forward as well to our Congress, our annual Congress event. So we'll close now for this Bright Talk session. Thank you very much, Dan. Again, that concludes our session today. Again, if you have missed anything from this webinar, it will be available on demand via the Cyber Awareness Hub, which you can access down below, where you'll also be able to download your free Cyber Awareness Month resource kit. We still have an exciting upcoming program this week, and I encourage you to register and share across your network. Attending live is good. You can see you can have these interactions. You can bring your questions, and we can take them as we speak. But of course, on demand as well is just as effective. It provides a resource to strengthen resilience throughout the organization. So please share amongst your peers, your colleagues. And then finally, if you have enjoyed today's session, please give us a rating, leave a rating down below in the Bright Talk interface. And I look forward to seeing many of you this afternoon. We have another session this afternoon with Paul Holland from the ASF. He'll be offering some authors' insights into the ASF's research into protecting our industrial control system. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.